For obvious reasons, the coronavirus is hitting Democratic areas much harder than conservative areas. There are a few polls that came out that I felt were kind of misleading that tried to make it seem like conservatives were being stupid. They basically said that conservatives not only weren't preparing for this, but that they didn't actually think they would get infected, or they didn't think there was a high risk. Now, the media framed it as though Republicans were listening to Trump, so they weren't paying attention. Thus, they didn't think they could get sick, and they didn't bother preparing. In reality, many conservatives probably already have supplies, especially those who live in rural areas. And the reason why many of them are not concerned about catching the coronavirus is because they don't live in New York City or any other big city for that matter. Because it is a fact, for obvious reasons, that the coronavirus is hitting big urban areas. Look, big cities tend to be left-leaning, higher population density, more people getting sick, higher opportunity to get sick. Rural areas, I've heard stories from people who say that their neighbor is a couple blocks away, half a mile away, even miles away. Yeah, I'm not surprised these people aren't really concerned about catching it. They have supplies because they only go to the store every so often. You know, I'm talking to people in rural areas right now who are telling me, get out, Tim, you got to get out of the cities. And they say, oh, the place I'm at doesn't even have a grocery store. How do you get food? We got to drive about a 45 minute drive. You go, you stock up as much as you can. You go only a couple times a month. And I'm like, naturally, these people don't have a lot of contact. They're not super worried about it. What we're seeing now is that a combination of high density areas plus, I'm going to say, liberal sensibilities and policies are going to completely disrupt and potentially destroy the economies and the lives of many people in these urban districts. Now, it's mostly because they're just cities, but when you combine the fact that they're high density with the liberal policy and the liberal mindset, I shouldn't even say liberal, but more leftist, they're particularly vulnerable. And I'll show you what I mean. Take a look at this story. Coronavirus hits Democratic communities harder than Republican counterparts from March 20th. Well, this, I think, is fairly obvious. As I stated, we all kind of get it. But let's see what that results in. This is a story from BuzzFeed. A management company emailed hundreds of tenants demanding they pay rent. It backfired. BuzzFeed News spoke to people across the nation about how they are negotiating, some successfully, for lower rents as the coronavirus leaves millions without jobs. Now, I understand right now, people are out of work and they can't pay their rent. But you understand, too, that the rental management companies, they pay for utilities, maintenance, security, just general keeping the place nice and tidy, paying utilities, or I said that already, taxes. There's a lot of things that go into running a management business for properties. The left would say that landlord isn't a job, and that's the excuse they use to say, I should not have to pay rent. The problem is that every piece of the economy is stitched together. There's no one, part of the economy that's in a vacuum. Everyone provides a service in some capacity, and it all roots down to the essential services. If you live in a building and you pay rent, there's probably a mortgage on that building. There's a janitor, a custodian or a building manager, depending on the size of the building you live in. Now, of course, because people on the left think that landlord isn't a job and they don't understand how economics works, when everyone gets, hit from this, they say, we're not going to pay rent. Do you know what happens next? This is a domino effect in the ripple of the collapsing economy. And do you know where it leads us? Nurses and doctors are getting pay cuts and they're getting laid off. So this does jump back to some things that Donald Trump has been talking about. The cure can't be worse than the disease. We might have to get our economy back up and running. We might have no choice. He's completely right. But how you balance the difficult decision of when to open the economy versus the coronavirus deaths, I don't know what to tell you. But I will tell you this. I'm going to read you this story about people not wanting to pay rent. Why? Because the company, the management company sent them a letter saying, you still got to pay rent. And they were like, oh yeah, rent strike because you can't evict us. Well, they can evict you after this is all over. But guess what? There are other employees who work for these rental management firms. This is what I was warning about all throughout March or to the end of March. When rent was due on the 1st, or, it's between around the first week, and not everybody pays rent on the same day, you're going to see a major explosion in the disruption of the economy. Because first you had the service industry cut off, retail industry cut off. Now you're seeing basic, building management companies, real estate, all being cut off. The next wave of individuals to have no money and no jobs is coming because these people can't or won't pay rent. I can completely respect many people cannot pay rent. And I don't know what you do about that. The stimulus package is coming, Perhaps you should pay rent if the government is going to guarantee your wages for 4 months and cut you a bonus check of $1,200. Some people might even get $600 on top of their unemployment, in which case that's why you should pay your rent. But of course they don't want to. It's a combination of the high density urban area, but their politics. Let's check it out. BuzzFeed writes, Nyla Houtsey, 24, lost most of her income as a freelance photographer, videographer, and event planner when all Californians were ordered to stay home. To help stop the spread of the coronavirus, she had to cancel an event she organized in the Bay Area and refund customers for the tickets they had already purchased. Any events she was hired to photograph were scrapped. I also know many people who are videographers, photographers, all lost their gigs. So now they're broke. So I get it. I respect it. Houtsey, who lives in Culver City, had about a month's worth of rent saved. Her roommate, Alex Mercier, 26, lost his job in mid-March. A third roommate had not been around much since the stay-at-home policy was announced, and Houtsey didn't know whether he was going to pay his share. On March 31st, the day before rent was due, an official at the company, Saturn Management, emailed tenants telling them they were still required to pay rent, and there would be consequences if they didn't. The governor of California has instituted an emergency ordinance relating to the payment of rent that although delays eviction for non-payment of rent, it does not prohibit an eviction for non-payment of rent in the future. Rents are still due, it said. But the company seemed to make a big mistake. It failed to BCC the more than 300 tenants, which would have concealed all their email addresses. Or they didn't think they needed to. But they probably should have, because you don't want to, give someone else's email address. Armed with that information, the Saturn Management tenants became the latest group of renters among many throughout the country who are organizing a strike. While these can be risky and end in eviction proceedings, the coronavirus has left many people with no income and little choice than to not pay rent. Activists who have organized rent strikes for years told BuzzFeed News that these actions may be more effective now because unemployment numbers have skyrocketed to historic highs, and a larger number of tenants have an incentive to join rent strike movements. This is the entitlement of leftist ideology. When they go on Twitter and say landlord isn't a job, they're basically saying, I don't know what's required in the management of properties. These are the same kind of people who think you can just take an empty house and put a homeless person in it. They don't seem to realize that buildings fall apart, that there's crime, that there's building maintenance, utilities, the things I've mentioned 50 billion times already in this video. When you buy property, this is what people don't get, especially investment property. They also have to hire somebody typically to manage the property. So let's say someone buys an investment house. I'm not a big fan of investment properties, but whatever, fine. So let's say somebody buys an extra house and they have it somewhere, very far away from them. They can't just leave it empty. Somebody will come in, smash the windows, they'll break stuff. They have to hire someone because also things fall apart, animals break in, bugs. There could be a pipe could burst, and then what? So I know people who've recently had pipes burst in their apartments and water sprays everywhere. What do you do? Oh, but landlord isn't a job. Then you deal with it. No, you call the landlord. They know the building. What people also don't realize is that if you're only planning on living in a place for 1 year, then yes, landlord is a job because they have to manage that property for 30 plus years, especially if they have a mortgage on it. So the person who owns it says, you're going to pay a little bit more. I'm going to make a small profit managing the property. It's work. I have to hire people. That's the job. I'm sorry. But in their minds, not understanding how this works, they're just like, why can't I just be in this property? Because they don't understand that the city is paying, for services to that property, that there's property taxes involved, and it's part of a much bigger system. So they decide to strike. And that will be another domino knocked over in our economy, which leads to, how about this one? U.S. hospital workers to have wages cut by medical staffing company. It's all tied together. Now, I'm not saying there's a direct connection between landlords and hospitals, but the people who work for those management companies will now not get paid. The company's going to start laying all of them off. And then once again, as people stop spending money and there are less services and less resources, then the hospitals won't have money either eventually, and that's what's happening. But let's read back about what they're saying. BuzzFeed News interviewed tenants organizing in LA and Washington, D.C., as well as tenants who successfully got their rent reduced in Brooklyn about how they're organizing. Everyone understands that there is power in numbers and that we're in the unique time. This is what's mind-blowing about this. Imagine if there was like a food strike and people went to the grocery store and were like, there's more of us than you, and we demand free food, they'd be like, get out of our store. You're demanding a service. Somebody did work to provide this hovel for you. And now you're getting all your buddies together and saying, nope, it's ours now. Like, by all means, you can steal the stuff. But when you're being given something that's maintained by someone else, it's not some great, freedom-loving movement. You're literally just taking other people's labor. This is different than food. I get it. Shelter is very important. Food is very important. But again, think about the mentality they have where they're like, we have power in numbers. Yeah, so does a mob when they go and loot a store during, a depression. In New York City, commercial burglaries, let's just call it what it is, looting in a time of crisis, are up 75%. Is that power in numbers? Could you imagine if all these people went out in New York and like, we shouldn't have to pay for the food in this grocery store. We have power in numbers. Smashed all the windows out and just started taking stuff. Yeah, it's true. You do have power in numbers. There are things that the kids in Chicago, I see them do. They would raid stores. That's what they call a raid. So you have all these kids get out of school at the exact same time. They're all 14, 15 years old. And there's like 30 or 40 of them. And they'd be like, hey, you guys want to raid, a 7-Eleven? And they would all run in someone would hold the door open. They'd all run in full speed and just grab everything they could and run out full speed because you couldn't stop any of them. That's similar to what this is. Let's all get together and not pay for the economic services we receive. All right, here's what they say. The Alliance of Californians for Community Empowerment has organized months-long rent strikes in Oakland and San Francisco, and who is also a co-founder of Moms for Housing, the group of mothers who occupied an investor-owned home in the Bay Area and, after being evicted from it, cut a deal to purchase the home. Her organization has been flooded with requests for help since the coronavirus began destroying the workforce. People are really understanding that if they want to get through this, they have to rely on each other. She told BuzzFeed News. For the Saturn management tenants, the quick reply alls that excluded the company made it clear that a lot of people would be interested in organizing a rent strike. We can see this tweet. So the company we pay our rent to sent out a very condescending mass emails. Now we're all on a rent strike. Haha, yeah. The food delivery service that provides food for the grocery store had its trucks raided. That's what they get. The food should have been free. I'll tell you what, man. At a certain point, everything does break down. And you can live in a place and not take care of it for kind of a long time. So it is different. I'm not trying to, say like, look, food spoils and there's delivery involved. But no, you could build a house. Someone could do all that labor. The trucks come in, takes all the energy. And then you could occupy that house because it's yours and all the labor that went into it, you don't think you should have to pay. But this is similar to the mentality they have with like healthcare being a human right. Well, let's do this. All right. Wait, hold on. Let me read you one more quote. You may not have a job or food, but you better pay rent, one tenant wrote to the other tenants. They quickly realized how powerful it was to have this list of contact information. I don't think they realized it just gave us an incredible organizing tool by giving us every single resident's email from every single building they own. A single building doing a rent strike is strong, but residents from every single building unionizing and doing a rent strike is godly. So what happens when the bank starts seizing all the properties? Then what? Well, but there's an eviction freeze right now, so there's not really anything they can do. But this will absolutely sever another link in the economy. To be fair, to point out, some of these people just don't have the money to pay the rent. So the economic severing will happen no matter what. The dominoes are falling over. But again, it goes back to this mentality that certain things are rights. Housing is a human right, they say. Well, who's going to build the house? Who's going to maintain the house? These people seem to think that because they're living in a society where they've stood on the shoulders of giants, they're entitled to the shoulders they're standing on, not realizing they might go away. No one has any obligation to hold you up. So yes, there are many buildings that exist. I'll tell you what. Go to Detroit. Go to Crown Heights. Go to Brooklyn. Look at all the buildings. Go to East New York. There are a ton of empty buildings. By all means, squat in those and you'll get why there is a serious issue with you'll get why landlord is a job. None of these people have any understanding. They are naive and they are entitled. COVID-19 hits some healthcare workers with pay cuts and layoffs. And you know what I see on Twitter from this? It's people saying like, these nasty corporations, blah, 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 blah. The hospitals? I mean, yeah, hospitals can make a lot of money right now. But they're not cutting pay to their nurses and doctors because they're like, I'm going to make better profits for myself. They're going, well, we have a budget shortfall. We're going to have to lay everybody off or everyone gets a 20% pay cut. We're going to lay off 10%, 20% of our staff, or recover 20% of that money with massive pay cuts. What do you think they're going to choose? Pay cuts first, then layoffs. So let's talk about the economy. All these people are looking to say, like Trump says, we got to get the economy going. And they're like, you're going to let old people die. You're going to let these people die and get sick. And it's like, you realize if the economy goes, there won't be nurses or doctors. We're already seeing nurses quit. We're already seeing doctors ask questions about whether they're obligated to actually serve right now. But of course, they think healthcare is a human right. Let me get to the point about what all this is. The leftist ideology will be crushed by the coronavirus. We've seen the social justice, luxury, and vanity politics being crushed already. Is anybody really going to be concerned about what, letter is in the word woman right now when people are dying? For the most part, no. Your vanity projects are not real. It is not violence when someone called you a silly name. It is serious when someone is in a hospital bed and they're dying. But now we can see what's going to happen to all these people who think healthcare is a human right. Okay, go to the hospital. And they're going to say, I'm sorry, there's no room. We're out of ventilators. We're out of beds. You have no right to anything because it doesn't exist. That's the funniest thing to me. You know what I always say, and many of you may be familiar with this, but for those that aren't, go into the middle of woods, buck naked. All right, let's say you're dropped in the middle of the woods, you're buck naked. Tell me about your rights. All right, I'll tell you what, you can yell. You can say whatever you want. No one can stop you. You can defend yourself. You can freely move around. You can literally eat whatever you want to eat. Those are your rights. And you have a right to protect yourself, to be safe. So if an animal comes at you, you protect yourself. If another person does, you still have the right to protect yourself. What about housing? Where's your right to housing? Is it the stump that's been hollowed out? An old big stump? Yeah, okay, I guess that's it. You can go in a cave. No, you want a house? Well, someone has to build that. So how could it be a right if it doesn't exist? What about healthcare? You're walking around, you're alone. There's no right to healthcare. There's no healthcare to be provided by anybody. And let's say you fall down and break your leg and you see another person, you say, hey, you, healthcare is my human right. Get over here and fix my leg. They're going to walk over to you, take whatever stuff you might have and leave. So it's not a right. It's a privilege that someone else would provide to you their time, energy, and labor to help you. You cannot force people. Of course, that's what Bill de Blasio wants to do. So it's no surprise. He's saying he wants to draft by force, mandatory, 45,000 doctors. Well, nobody thinks that's possible. So now he's pleading and begging. Thank God for the Constitution. And it's still not perfect because we've still had conscription in this country. But now I go back to what we're seeing here. COVID is slamming urban centers where the big liberal strongholds. That's where they all are. People are fleeing. It's a census year. Think about that. When these people start spreading out into, people from New York start leaving, and not everybody's leaving, but a lot are, during a census year. Many people haven't filled out the census. I don't know exactly what will happen, but I imagine to a certain extent that will reduce the amount of representatives these big urban centers have as people leave. These people will then spread out and dilute into more conservative areas and be very unlikely to displace the already conservative areas. Now, it is possible. Like places where I'm at right now, it's 50-50. It's like half conservative, half liberal in the place where I live. And if a bunch of liberals flee the cities and come out here, it will tilt the scales. But there are many red areas and other parts, surrounding big cities, suburbs, and more rural areas that are going to absorb these liberals and displace them in the vote. Meaning, I think ultimately, the left is going to be slammed the worst by this in many, many different ways. The main point I want to make about the rent strike, I hope it was clear enough, is that they're just eating themselves. These companies that work in New York are also, typically, they're probably more moderate because they understand why being a landlord is a job. But they're still going to be left. They're still going to vote for Democrats and all that stuff. And now it's become a circular firing squad. The cities are going to start eating themselves alive. People are going to flee. They're not going to pay their bills. These management companies are going to collapse. It's not just about this will be interesting. How will if they put a moratorium on mortgages, then these rental companies might not need to pay them, but they still have to pay their staff. They're going to lay their staff off. We see businesses going under completely. There was a really sad post that went viral. It was about like a local family restaurant that was open for, decades, like 40 years, shuttered completely, done, gone, never coming back. A lot of these businesses know they're never going to come back because they can't withstand a month or 2 months of complete economic shutdown. Many of these businesses hardest hit are in big cities. So what happens? A ripple effect strikes the cities. There's a massive economic downturn in the cities. And for many conservatives, especially people who grow their own food or hunt, they're going to be less impacted by this. They'll stay in a much similar place to where they were. Back to the main point. They try and make it seem like conservatives aren't prepared or aren't worried about this. And it is true, there are a lot of Trump supporters who are downplaying this, and it's very strange to me why they are. But there are a lot. Think about it this way. Who went out to buy guns? When news broke, was it the Second Amendment cheering, gun-toting conservative who said, I better go buy a gun right now? Perhaps some really zealous gun owners. But for the most part, the comments I see from people are the gun owners putting their feet up, putting their hands behind their back and saying, I've had my guns for years. And then who is buying the guns? Well, in urban centers, gun stores are getting flooded. And a viral video comes out where a gun store owner is like, these first-time gun buyers have no idea what they're doing, and they think they can just walk in here and get a gun. Maybe they should have paid more attention when these bills were being put up. People were trying to pass laws to take away your stuff. It's not the conservatives who are rushing to buy guns. They already got them. It's the liberals. The leftist ideology is being crushed under the weight of reality. That a lot of the politics they had were vanity politics. Now let's walk some stuff back for a second. This crisis may result in a bolstering of many other leftist ideologies, right? Universal health care, universal basic income, guaranteed income. Spain is toying with universal basic income. We're seeing, a lot of talk now, even from Trump, that perhaps we need to expand Medicaid to all uninsured people because we're in a serious crisis. A crisis may result in a nationalized healthcare system. So some ideas that are much more simple, like should everybody have access to healthcare and can we afford it, are very different from is landlord a job. But we'll see how things play out. You can absolutely have very conservative people who still believe in universal basic income. It's not, look, we basically have universal firefighting and universal policing. And so universal healthcare is a possibility, even if someone is an ultra traditionalist, far right, whatever you want to call it. The point is, the ideology, the ideas of this like youthful naivety of healthcare being a human right or housing being a human right don't necessarily hold up to scrutiny when the collapse is upon us. But anyway, I could rant too long on this. Let me just wrap it up. I'll put it this way. The cities are most likely to be infected. The cities are the ones who are going to get slammed by by the negative economics the worst. And these are the people who are going to have to rethink their own policies or flee the city. So I think there is good reason to believe the left, Democrats, are going to be crushed and splattered. We'll see what happens. I mean, they were already shattered between the progressives and the moderates. I don't know what to expect next, but you get the point. I'll see you on the next segment at 1 p.m. on this channel. Thanks for hanging out.